Okay, guys, how we doing? This is a special edition of the Taft Performance Podcast. Really excited. I've got the staff, the owners, the creators of Resilient Performance Physical Therapy. They just came out with this new online course, Resilient Performance Systems online course, and it's phenomenal. I was fortunate enough to get a good sneak preview, and I've gone through it actually multiple times. It creates an avenue for us to understand why we move, the way we should, how function and position interrelate and interconnect, and there's just so many golden nuggets. So, excuse me, I'm so fortunate to have the owners on and the creators of this course. So I've got with us Dr. Greg Spatz, Dr. Trevor Rappa, and Dr. Doug Katejian. Guys, thank you so much for being a part of the show today.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us on. We appreciate it.
Absolutely. So let's do this. Let's just go ahead and have you take a second, kind of introduce yourself, quickly. We'll go through. So I introduced you first, Greg. So you go ahead and introduce yourself a little deeper and maybe talk a little bit about the program, and then we'll go right through each one of you.
Yeah, I'm Greg Spatz. I'm a physical therapist and performance coach, and the three of us started Resilient Performance back in 2015. We all met in physical therapy school, and it was sort of a perfect situation for us that we kind of stumbled upon. But before physical therapy school, I was a strength and conditioning coach with the Arizona Diamondbacks in the minor league system. So I like to say that I wouldn't be here talking to any of you guys right now if it weren't for them, because they really introduced me to a lot of the stuff I do now. And I mean, I didn't know anything back then. I still feel like I don't, but they've kind of set me on my path. So that's where I was sort of introduced to anything that we're talking about today. But yeah, happy to be here.
Awesome. Thank you. Doug, you want to go ahead?
I'm Doug Katejian. Thanks for having us, Lee. So I'm the old guy of the group. I'm about almost like 10 years older than the other guys. But the funny story was how we all met. I was in the library at PT school, and I saw this guy who turned out to be Trevor wearing a Mike Boyle strength and conditioning T-shirt, and I had an intern at Cressy's a couple years before that. And it's like, what are the chances that someone who's wearing a Mike Boyle shirt is not there for physical therapy school? So it turned out that he was in the class behind me. He told me about Greg, who had worked for the Diamondbacks, and we kind of all had an interest in the performance side of things. Then ultimately developed a friendship, which turned into a business relationship. So I work in the New York facility primarily with Resilient, and then prior to that, I was in the Air Force, where I worked as a pararescueman, where we did search and rescue for the military. So that's kind of shaped a lot of my ideas about, preparation and physical training. And and even, like your work as well. So kind of the idea with rehab and our philosophy is you've got to be ready for whatever it is that you need to do. And in physical therapy school, we get a lot of the, the rehab centric stuff, but like your progressions with change of direction have been immensely helpful in preparing our athletes. So being able to learn from different fields, I think, is what these conversations are really about.
That's awesome. Yeah, thank you. I appreciate that. Trevor, go ahead, man.
Yeah, so they kind of filled in most of the gaps there. And I'm Trevor Rappa. Like Doug said, I interned at Boyles prior to going to PT school. And I think, like Greg said, it's meeting in PT school is really fortunate for all of us, because we found people who were like-minded and kind of motivated and wanted to end up learning and kind of doing the same things. And it's been really cool just kind of going through this journey of owning the business and learning more together and figuring out how to help athletes, and like learning from other professionals like yourself, Lee, who have been hugely, influential and been great mentors for us.
Oh, that's great. So you guys have two facilities. I know you got one in New York City, but where is your second facility?
Our second facility is in Chatham, New Jersey. So like Doug said, he works in Manhattan only. I go back and forth between both, and then Greg only works at the Chatham location.
Awesome. Great. Greg, is there any connection with your facility that is primarily baseball oriented in your background? Is that a connection that happened because of your background? How did that facility come about? Yeah,
definitely. So our New Jersey facility, we rent space inside of a gym called Annex Sports Performance and Fitness. The owner there, his name is Mickey Bruckner. He's had the business for probably a dozen years at this point. Mm-hmm. He's been around a long time. And he works with a lot of baseball players. He himself played baseball at a pretty high level. And then because of that, and his interest in baseball, he really liked to, focus on the pitching athlete. So he attracted a lot of baseball players and had a few that he wanted somebody to work with. And at the time we were only in New York. And he was connected through one of his coaches, Eric Manis, who was, friend of a friend. Everybody's kind of knows each other at this point. And he would bring a couple athletes into the city, and then eventually just kind of started a conversation about us moving into the space that he had in New Jersey. That took probably about a year to actually happen. But yeah, so my background in baseball definitely kind of created that connection a little bit. Like if I didn't play baseball and work in baseball at all, I don't know that I would have, really been introduced to Mickey. So it's been a fortunate experience.
That's great. That's cool. It's a cool facility. I was fortunate enough and honored to go down and visit with you guys there, and I loved it. It was a really nice facility. You got the opportunity to do a lot of things with that space is, will allow you to do. So, hey, I want to kind of jump into some questions if you guys are cool with this, because I just think I love your philosophy. I love the concepts you use. And so, Doug, I want to ask you, you talk about like this complexity theory. Can you go into that a little bit to give the listeners kind of a little deeper in look as to what you're thinking of this complexity theory?
Sure. And with that, like, I'm not trying to be esoteric when I talk about it in the course, because you can say, oh, well, like things are so complex to the point that we don't really know anything and what are we supposed to do? And it can become very theoretical and philosophical to a point where like we're trying to our audience as coaches and people who actually have to apply information. But the idea with complexity theory is, as it pertains to training, we're working with, human beings who are very complex, and there are so many variables that influence performance. And we've got to figure out as coaches, what are the variables that are actually important and what can we impact? And if you look at like a different field, it can kind of help to enlighten what we're talking about as coaches. So when it comes to complexity, extremes are usually problematic. So if we're talking about like even a political thing like border security, if on the one hand you have people who are saying like we shouldn't have any borders, anybody who wants to come in should be able to without any vetting process, that's like a little bit problematic. But so is it also problematic to say let's just put a wall up and not let anybody in? So if we take an extreme position, we can say that like, we probably shouldn't be doing these things. So if we're talking about change of direction, right? There's like, and I don't like these dichotomies because I think that most things aren't an either or phenomenon, but for change of direction, it's like, do we only do these kind of, open loop change of direction drills, or should we do things like 5-10-5s that are very rehearsed and predictable? And the reality is like most coaches that I talk to aren't doing just one of those things. They're doing a combination of both. And there can be a time and a place for both. So like in a rehab setting, for example, like the first time you do change of direction work after an ACL surgery, you're not going to play tag with somebody with 5 other people who are, haven't just come off an ACL surgery. Like exactly. You want to be able to kind of minimize the degrees of freedom, reduce chaos, that you're trying to isolate variables in the system. So if it's a knee, right, you want to see, can this person actually produce good angles with their knee, load the knee, so that when they do end up doing a more complex movement pattern, we know that what they're doing is really a strategy that's effective and it's not compensation. So you need to be able to isolate parts of the system to make sure that everything is in working order. But if all you do is just isolate things, that's not what sport is about. So it's always this interplay between how do we take a complex movement and do things that like mimic the game versus breaking things down into their components. It's basically part whole training. And I think that the good coaches, have this idea of like intuitively of when to do what. So even like in a military setting, right? Like if all we ever did was full mission profiles where we just like, parachuted into an objective. We had like, mock enemy forces that had like paintball rounds and stuff like that. Even though that's the most realistic form of training, you don't develop the individual components of a mission. So like if you want to get better at jumping, you have to go away for a week and just jump 10 times a day. Right. If you want to get better at shooting, you have to spend hours on the range and do it's almost like the idea of like block training. Yeah. But if you take block training to its extreme, then you never integrate all the variables. That's kind of complexity. And I go into a little bit about like the theory behind it, but the idea behind the course is like theory is great, but what does this look like in practice? Because I think a lot of times especially on the internet, right, people have these like circular discussions that go nowhere because no one's willing to show what they actually do. And we have program templates, things we've actually done with athletes in the course. And it's not to say that like what we're doing is good or bad. It's like how we learn is through sharing information and then having conversations like we're having now and not being judgmental. So that's kind of the idea. So with complexity, we can be as esoteric as we want, but ultimately it comes down to almost like the art of coaching and how do you make that judgment between part, whole training and knowing when to really like be specific and mimic the game versus when to reduce the variables and work on isolated components and then bring it all together.
Yeah, that's great. And I love the point that you brought up. It's so important that everybody understands there's a place for all variations of exercise and intent of an exercise. And if you want to build some tissue quality in a movement, well, you're better off making it a rehearsed pattern. Like you said, maybe a 5-10-5 or a shuttle run, because I can predict where they're going to plant their foot and I can predict how many reps they're going to get in that. But if they're playing tag, they may only cut off their leg foot one time because because the situation demands that.
Exactly. Yep.
Yeah, no, that's great. Trevor, would you talk about, and I like how you go into, kind of like the lumbo-pelvic biomechanics, and and you can go in any direction you want. You talk a little bit about how extension and, back when I grew up, when I was younger, and muscle and fitness was the mother of all of all training. We followed Arnold Schwarzenegger, in squatting. It was this big hard back extension, lock in, don't have any movement. Would you talk a little bit about that lumbo-pelvic biomechanics and rhythm that's really important to be not only perform well, but to be safe?
Yeah, I think, one of the reasons why we really wanted to cover that with some depth was because of that kind of, spinal stabilization strategy that everyone has been taught, like you just said, which is kind of that hard arch, pinch your shoulder blades back, but not really understanding the kind of downstream effects it has actually, like, locally on the spine and the facet joints, which we cover, and then also in terms of hip impingement and how that affects just overall movement patterns because of the shift in your center of gravity that occurs with that type of spinalization strategy. And then also going in, a little bit more depth on the, kind of specific structures that are loaded with that pattern, which, like we said, is the spinal facet joints more than it is kind of distributing stress throughout, the other muscles of the trunk and pelvis.
I love that. And when you want to evaluate that in a client, could be an athlete, it might be somebody that's not injured, they're just a new athlete that you're working with. What are some of the things you're looking for? Like, how would you assess that if you want to see that normal rhythm from a basic standpoint? What would you look at exercise wise?
Well, that's, we always talk about how the training process is really our number one assessment. Us as physical therapists, we have the ability to put people on a table and check joints and check ranges of motion to be able to kind of create a bigger picture for ourselves. But ultimately, if you don't have that tool, and like Doug said, we wanted this product to be for coaches as well as therapists, is like from a dynamic movement assessment of watching somebody squat, watching somebody deadlift, watching somebody split squat, run, and all the different movement patterns that we have, or what are some of the things that we want to see. So that's why we talk about the model of movement, which is an idea I got from you, Lee. The first retreat that we did at your house, you talked about having a model of movement for, shuffling, sprinting, acceleration, all that stuff. And that really clicked for me because it gives us an idea of what are the things that we should be looking for. And then how do we actually, if we see a deviation from our model of movement, how do we get back to our model of movement? Yeah. So for example, with the squat, like we teach people to bend at their ankles, knees, and hips. We don't want to see people block their shins and not let their knees go forward. So one of the things I look for is pretty much a parallel line between their torso and their tibia. So that's just one of the things that I look for when I watch somebody squat, to know if they're kind of keeping that good mid-range position, because if they're really arching their back, they're not going to give me a parallel torso and tibia. I'm going to have a much more vertical tibia and a really push back, rear end. So those are just some of the things that we look for. And I think creating the model of movement has helped us a ton in terms of being able to help others kind of understand what are the things that we look for.
Yeah, I love that. And what's cool with the models, and you guys have talked about this, and Doug kind of alluded to it, is you develop a model and then you say, okay, how much bandwidth am I going to allow? And what other models can help my model? Uh-huh. Because, we realize, like, I have a model that I go, and I'm very biased because this is how I learned from back in the 80s up through to what I do. But I understand why other people have a different model. Like, I get it. I understand it. I just teach my model better for me. You know what I mean? Like, I can't I couldn't coach a pole vaulter because I was never a pole vaulter, right? I can look at how they run down the runway, and I can look at how they get off the mat, but all the stuff in between that matters. I can't do that model, but I can give you a model of sprinting to help you run. So it's kind of being able to, so yeah, I love that. I love that.
Yeah. And like going along with that too, to piggyback on that, like it's always dependent on the goal. And like Doug was saying, like there's different extremes. And if like one extreme is this huge arch back and pinched shoulder blades, like that's something you probably want to use if you're powerlifting and you need to lift the maximum amount of weight possible. But if that's something that if that's a client we're working with, then we understand that that's part of what they need to be able to do. So we're going to kind of flirt with that edge of the spectrum a little bit versus like somebody who's a field sport athlete. The goal isn't to back squat. The goal is to be a field sport athlete. So it's like, what's the focus and what's going to keep them healthy while we're still actually able to load them in a way that is going to cause an adaptation.
That's great. That's a great point. Greg, sticking with you, would you talk about, you talked about like this concept of distal performance is dictated by proximal orientation. Would you talk a little bit about that so the listeners, we understand the meaning of that a little bit more and how important that is in our function?
Yeah, for sure. And that's something that, it starts in Trevor's section for sure. And it's throughout the entire body. And just to keep, let's talk about the hips first for a second. So like Trevor was talking about, you arch your back and you tip your pelvis forward. That's changing your proximal orientation, right? So the acetabulums are going to be angled at a different position, which then if that's going to be your sort of bias and that's going to be your starting point, we should expect to see some differences in the femurs and how they're going to work. So we're trying to, we don't like to say like neutral spine or whatever. We like to call it a mid-range position because everybody's neutral. There is no neutral. It's like this, again, it's always moving and it's always changing. So same thing with my section. I talk about the upper body, right? So with the rib cage, if I'm in a more, going along with Trevor's section, if I'm in a more extended position, that's going to alter where my shoulder blades, my scapula are starting from, what my bias is to begin with movement. And then I'm going to expect to see on the table, I'm going to expect to see certain, ranges of motion that are different, which is probably beyond the scope of what we're doing in this talk right now. But essentially, if we don't respect the position of the rib cage, the spine, and the pelvis, we shouldn't expect to make changes that are healthy and long lasting for longevity with our athletes with shoulder issues or elbow issues. And with working with so many baseball players, I'll have to do this a lot with the rib cage and make sure they have the proper shoulder range of motion and that they're actually getting it from where they need. If I'm getting shoulder external rotation by doing this, that's not useful. That's very unhealthy for longevity. You probably get away with it for a while when you're 15 years old or whatever, and you can kind of you wear it for a while, but eventually it's going to come back and bite you. So that's something that we focus on primarily, is what is the trunk doing, because that's going to sort of dictate downstream effects. Like if you don't, something that you've taught us, like if you don't have some sort of proximal stiffness, like you can develop with a lot of these fake throws that we've stolen from you. If you don't have that proximal stiffness, you're going to see some force leak downstream when you're putting force into the ground, and your angles are going to change. So all goes back to that model of movement. What's the position that we're looking for? And primarily proximal.
Yeah, go ahead.
And so much of understanding like what the proximal orientation does downstream makes our coaching so much easier as well. Like if we see somebody who cannot dorsiflex because their weight is always on their tiptoes, so they always have this calf tone, but they're in this excessive bilateral extension pattern or anterior pelvic tilt, whatever you want to call it, we can cue them as much as we can or do different mobility drills to get them into dorsiflexion, but ultimately an easier fix just going to be getting them to control a better proximal position. And then we have to do less corrective exercise and things that just won't be as effective as just getting somebody into a better proximal position to let them access the ranges of motion that they actually do have. Like Doug said, the alphabet.
Yeah. Well, one thing you guys do really well is you have a really good eye to assess movement. Well, what makes that easier is because you understand what you're looking for and you understand the kinetic chain. If this is out of line, well, there's a good chance way upstream or way downstream is going to be out of line. And that helps you identify it quickly when somebody goes through a movement. Like you just said, a perfect example. If we watch somebody run, sprint, and they're way extended in their lumbar spine, but they have this laxity within the hip and maybe their shoulder blades are just squashed down and back, and of course they're going to be there, so we can identify that better. So yeah, those are great points. Doug, I wanted to ask you, you do a really good job of explaining how to safely and appropriately stretch through the hip capsule. And you do a really nice job of some stretching exercises that you take people through. What are some of the concerns as to why you want to make sure people understand how to get into that posterior hip? And what are some of the strategies that you would look for to use with people, or not, depending on who it is, right?
Yeah, so with the posterior hip, the reason why you want to have some extensibility there is because, we've all heard the saying, load to explode.
Yeah.
You can't load unless you can get into your posterior hip. So if we're talking about, we could talk about any plane of movement, right? Let's say we're talking about lateral change of direction.
Yeah.
If you want to plant and be able to absorb force, if you can't get, you're effectively in closed chain, internally rotating your hip. If you don't have extensibility in your posterior hip and or your proximal position is off, which it could, there's a lot of variables that could influence it. It could be like just tissue tone or length, and it could be proximal position. So we'll start with proximal position first, right? Like somebody who lives in that anterior tilt, when they go to load or to plant, they're not going to be able to sink into their hip because they're effectively already in hip flexion because their pelvis is anteriorly tilted. So they effectively have a bony block or an impingement there, and they're going to have to work around that problem. And it's usually the way to work around, flexion with an anterior tilt is to just externally rotate more, which kind of creates its own set of problems because that could, lead to laxity in the front of the hip in a place that you don't want it. It's the same thing in sprinting where if you're sprinting and you see somebody who runs in that anterior tilt, they're not going to have that vertical posture, which again is a range, right? But we've all seen runners who or when they sprint, they're really, really leaning forward where it's obvious even to an untrained eye. If you're doing that, now you're going to have to be backside when you run. So now you've got this really long lever. Instead of being able to get a good heel recovery, you've got this long lever, and now you've got to really pull your swing limb forward with the hip flexor. That leads to hip flexor overuse injuries. And because you've got that anterior tilt, now you have to externally rotate more to get into hip flexion. And on top of that, because of the physics involved, you have to land with your foot way out in front of you, which makes you more predisposed to a hamstring injury. So you've got an anterior tilt where your hamstring is already lengthened relative to that home base. And now you're landing with your foot in front because of the way your center of gravity is manipulated. So you need to be able to get into that, start in a neutral home base position. And then you need to have bandwidth in both directions. External rotation is not bad, but when you're loading, you want to be able to load from an internally rotated flex position. And if you don't have that available to you, now you're basically extending from extension or loading from a loaded position, and you don't have any bandwidth. So that's why that stuff is so important. And as part of whether it's through a formal assessment or through just your coaching eye, you need to be able to determine, can this person not load, i.e. flex or internally rotate, because it's like a tissue or a tone issue, or is it more of a proximal motor control pelvic positional issue? And it's stuff that you talk about all the time in your courses. We're really saying the same thing, just using different words.
Right. So if you were to assess someone and you were to put them on a table and you were just assessing their hip capsule and the posterior aspect of the hip, and it was not, maybe fairly low functioning, or it wasn't hitting the range that you would like, how would you see that present itself when they were standing up and doing, how would you test it standing up? What might be something you do? So
that's a good question. And that's it's not always 100%, but I would say starting with a table test, we want to see that somebody has internal rotation of their hip, that they can also extend, because usually people who can't extend their hip, without compensatory movement through their back,
right,
they're going to typically have a hard time internally rotating. Not always, but that's often the case. So we'll do a test where we'll basically stabilize somebody's sacrum, and then we'll try to extend their hip. And if they can't extend the hip with us stabilizing, then we know there's something that's blocking hip extension and probably internal rotation as well. Now, typically, we've all seen people who they test poorly on a table, but then when you watch them, they move well in real life and the things that matter. And some people will say, oh, well, that means the table tests don't matter. I still think, in an ideal world, assuming that we have time to work with the athlete and develop all these qualities, I'd rather see somebody who at least has the alphabet, so to speak, or the variability on the table, because now we know that, your eye, even no matter how calibrated and how good it is, it can deceive you. So at least we know if they have the positions on the table, that they're able to choose from them when they do the complex task. Because some athletes are really good compensators and they can look good to us, but maybe they're working around it. Yeah, working around a restriction. So I don't think it's an either or. Like, I want athletes to, I'm not saying like move perfectly on a table, because there is no perfect, but like, I'm just saying we don't want to see athletes who have like 0 degrees of hip internal rotation on a table. And we actually see that all the time. It's not like we're not saying, oh, we've got to take a goniometer out and like we're trying to get them from 35 to 40. I just want them to have something. I want them to move like a normal human being, because I think what we find is that the less human somebody is, i.e. like if they can run a sub 1000, but they move like garbage on the table, that disconnect between general ability and specific ability is oftentimes what puts somebody at risk from a health standpoint. Like, you shouldn't be so specialized as an athlete that you know when you go to touch your toes, you're like 2 feet off the floor. We're looking for extremes and low hanging fruit, not like 1 or 2 degrees of each thing.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you for explaining that, because that's really, really important. Trevor, I wanted to ask you, you did a really nice job of explaining lower body movements and mechanics and all. Walk us through the split squat and some of the mistakes that you see, because I would say that is a go-to exercise for most trainers and coaches to go to be able to safely train their clients if they didn't want to load them, just using the single leg, which becomes inherently more intense. But what are some of the mistakes that you commonly see executing the split squat?
I'd say one of the main things, especially like one of the clients I'm working with right now, is getting back from her ACL surgery. She's, roughly about 2 months out. And when you see people who don't want to load their knee, they really have their front foot way out in front of their knee. So they're not really getting into any knee flexion, and they're keeping all the weight on their heel, which is going to load their glute and hamstring more. That's one of the common. So they take kind of a really long split, like you would see like in a yoga type of like split squat or lunge position, where their back leg is almost straight. And they're really not even bending their back knee. They're just kind of like pushing their body weight down towards the floor. So we like to have people with that, their foot kind of underneath their front knee in a straight line between their backside hip, knee, and shoulder as they go up and down. So that way they're maintaining actual hip extension when they reach the bottom of the movement, and they're not getting their kind of butt kicked back with this lot of quad tone that's keeping them kind of pulled forward and keeping them in hip flexion as they're trying to go down and actually get into hip extension. So those are kind of some of the things that we see. It's just the bias of people not wanting to load one leg or the other, or not wanting to actually let their knees bend while keeping that good proximal thoracic and pelvic position.
Yeah, I love that. And, I've been one, and I've caught some criticism for this, because I know as a society, we always immediately say, oh, they're too weak in the posterior chain. They don't have hamstrings and glutes. But I've worked with a lot of like young ladies, 12, 13, 14-year-olds. And when they can't decelerate, it's usually they can't control knee flexion. The quads just say, nope, I'm out.
Yes. Yeah. I totally agree.
Yeah. So I think there has to be, we forget about quads. We think quads over dominate everything. And I'm going to tell you, a lot of the athletes I work with, they don't have any quads. They can't decelerate from landing or a basic slow tempo split squat like you're talking about.
Yeah, I think, like what you see from a compensatory strategy with that is they like either are trying to always keep that limb locked. So they're basically just, in 10 degrees of knee flexion constantly, and they're never actually going to deeper levels of knee flexion, or they don't let their knee go towards their toe. And like you said, you can't decelerate or you can't load if I don't get into actual dorsiflexion. And that's one of the reasons why like we want to see dorsiflexion with our split squat, with our squat, with our deadlift. We really look for that flexion at the ankles, knees, and hips kind of all the time, because it shows that they're able to distribute stress across 3 joints rather than just 1 or 2.
Yeah, that's great. That's really good. Greg, and I know this is really paramount in the sport of baseball or a quarterback or tennis or anybody throwing, but you did a nice job of explaining scapular movement and some of the mistakes that we see of locking down those scapulars and then trying to go through a range of motion. Would you talk a little bit about that, and maybe use an example of, you could use a push-up if you wanted, or something like that, to talk about the rhythm of the scapula?
Yeah, sure. So definitely, like, I know for myself, when I was growing up playing baseball, I was always told to, pinch your shoulder blades together when you're doing any of these band exercises or things like that, because that was always sort of known as, that's a stable scapula because it's as close to your body as possible.
Right.
But we would sort of take a little bit different of an approach to that. And, that bias of having the scapula in that downwardly rotated, retracted position is going to, like we already spoke about, going to change where the glenoid sits and then how the humerus acts. So first talking about like anything overhead, a thrower, if you're not a thrower, if you're lifting overhead, if you're trying to keep your shoulder blade in this downward position, which maybe you were, with good intention, coached to do that as a younger athlete, and that's something that's just in your head, like, oh, I have to keep my shoulder blade down while I'm doing these things. If you're doing that, you're taking away some of what we would expect to see as like a normal scapulohumeral rhythm, where we want the scapula to move, as almost as much as we can, so that we're not requiring more movement or in range positions at the shoulder blade or at the shoulder joint. So if my shoulder blade doesn't move and I go to lift my arm, I'm going to have shoulder impingement sooner. My acromion is just going to be in the way. There's only a few millimeters of space there with 4 nerve tissues running through. So it's not really conducive to that position. So we like to focus on having as much of a reach, so to speak. I always say the word reach with people doing, like you said, push-ups or overhead pressing, because that reach is going to have them move their scapulas as much as possible into that position. So then for something like a push-up, like if you're even just in the top of a push-up position, like with your arms straight out, if your shoulder blades are already sort of like retracted and popping off of your rib cage, and you can't change that, and you can't bring your rib cage backward, you're already starting, like Doug was already, talking about being in a flex position to begin with change of direction. You're already starting at your end position, so you have nowhere really to go. So you're not really distributing the stress through your shoulder blade and getting muscles that we like to use for throwers and for just distal performance of the upper extremities. We're not getting some serratus anterior activity if our shoulder blades are always, staying in that position. So we like to focus on a nice long reach, and then from there we're trying to almost like maintain that, because if gravity wins, or if you have a barbell in your hand and that wins and it beats your shoulder blades, you've already lost. And then any of this is just going to be essentially bodybuilding training. So we're trying to promote proximal orientation, proximal stiffness with the rib cage, and then the shoulder blade is another thing that we need. We need stiffness on, fighting against that force. So I think that answers your question about what we want the shoulder blades to be doing against the rib cage.
Yeah, that's perfect explanation, because we've all been taught different. And again, I believe it was you, Greg, who even talked about, if I'm working with a power lifter and they're squatting, okay, they might have to do something different because that sport demands it. And it might be the same thing with a bench press. If I'm trying to set a world record in the bench press, well, I might have to do something different than normal population, knowing that those compensations are going to probably greatly limit my range of motion in normal function. But to be a power lifter, I don't know that I want a ton of freedom all the time. I need to be able to, so yeah. It's having that ability.
100%.
Would each of you kind of give and you could even do it to kind of what you've each already talked about, but talk about breathing a little bit and how breathing is just helpful in helping position, helping open things up. Even if you want to, if one of you even wants to go into the parasympathetic and sympathetic, but how does that help position if I understand breathing better? So Doug, if you want to start, and then I'll go through or Greg, yeah.
Yeah, I was just going to jump in since that was my section, but we'll talk a little bit about breathing in the third section that I go over. And I think of it mostly, I'm focusing mostly on it when I'm doing some sort of intervention with breathing. It's because I want to change position. I'm not ultimately trying to deal too much with sympathetic, parasympathetic with my population. So how that might affect movement. So if we have that bilateral extension pattern that Trevor goes into, and then we kind of elaborate on, if we have that extended position with a flat back, and sort of this big protruding chest and ribs sticking out, it's just sort of like path of least resistance. Where is air going to be most likely to go? So if I'm in this position, I'm sort of closed in the back and then I'm open in the front. So when I take a breath in, stuff's just going to go in the front, which can promote this position and kind of reinforce it and make it like, this is where I want to be. So if we see that with somebody, we might see differences in how their shoulders move, how they're able to access positions overhead, and how that kind of can trickle downstream to the lower body as well. So if we want to change somebody's ability to expand their back and close down the front, we might have them do some sort of reaching activity where they're getting some more kyphosis because they're typically very flat in the back. They're getting some more kyphosis, and then just by biasing their position, maybe have them in almost like a rock back, almost like a child's pose type thing, or quadruped, where they're reaching. We're just going to have them breathe in that position and expand different parts of their rib cage that they otherwise, aren't normally doing like throughout the day or with exercise. And that's going to then change the trickle down effect of where my scapulas are going to sit, where my pelvis is going to sit, and sort of just where that home base is. I'll let you guys.
So when you do that, and I'll let you guys go. So when you're explaining that, you're trying to affect the tissue, so therefore then the bony structures adjust as well, correct? You're trying to get some extensibility just by blowing air into those pockets, right?
Yeah, I would say it's more like a tone thing. Like we're trying to reduce tone on structures and muscles that are always on. And I'll explain it to patients as like, if every muscle in your body has a dimmer switch, some on your back are probably turned up too high, some on the front might be turned down too low. So we got to sort of even those out a little bit. And to do that, we have to put you in this position and have you breathe a little bit. And that sort of just, easily kind of draws a picture for them, makes sense. I'm working with a lot of high school kids too, so they need some sort of, visuals like that as well.
That's great. Yeah. Trevor, go ahead, or Doug.
I was just going to say how what Greg talked about. I'd say there's kind of two things that for myself, and when I think about what I covered in the section in terms of breathing related, and it's like that kind of idea of spinal stability, which what Greg talked about with like that power lifter, traditional power lifter, big arch position, doesn't allow us to have optimal intra-abdominal pressure, and it creates us or makes us find more stability from our facet joints kind of being jammed together, this passive stability, this impingement in our back, versus when we actually have the ability to kind of close down the front and get air, throughout our entire thorax, if you will, lets us kind of have 360 degrees of stability. And it's not just sagittal plane stability, but it's frontal and transverse plane stability, which is, so hugely important for acceleration and change of direction and sprinting and all that, and dynamic environments. And that's why we kind of go over the soda can analogy, where it's like a soda can, when it's pressurized, I could stand on it all day and it's not going to break. But if I were to arch that soda can or open it up and then dent it, I am naturally decreasing some of its stability, and I can reinforce the exterior of the soda can, but eventually it's going to break. But what's going to fix it is just finding a way to kind of repressurize the system. And that's why, the breathing stuff for us is important, but we try not to overemphasize it. We just want to get people in good proximal positions and then let the difficulty of the task dictate how they breathe. And that's something that I speak a lot with my clients, is if we're doing some of those easier type of exercises at the beginning of each section that aren't really with load, they're not with speed, they're not overly demanding, I don't want to see people holding their breath and using a really high threshold breathing strategy to accomplish the task, because it kind of doesn't make sense. It's very inefficient. So I want people to be able to breathe and kind of feel what we're trying to go after with this, so they get an idea of what's going on, and they can kind of build the connection to different parts of their body. And then as we get going and we're doing things that are faster and harder, the breathing strategy will change. But if we're doing something submaximal, I shouldn't see somebody breathing like a power lifter, like Thor when he pulled 1,104 pounds, where he's using this super high threshold, Valsalva maneuver. Like, he has to for that task. I don't want to see people use that type of task if we're doing something much more submaximal. It'll be the same thing if we're watching somebody, do sprints and just completely hold their breath, because that's going to just restrict their degrees of freedom and limit how much they can move.
Yeah, that's great. I love that. Doug, do you want to go ahead and add some thoughts?
Yeah, the last thing I would add, and I think that Greg and Trevor touched on it, is like, what's the intent? To be clear, we're like, when I have somebody sprint or change direction or even like lift heavy weights, I don't want them to think about breathing at all, actually, because that's when it's time to perform. So part of like, good coaching is putting people in positions to be successful. So like if we're doing like a Zercher variation of a squat or a lunge or whatever, we know that because of where the bar is, they're going to reflexively have to stabilize the way that we want. We don't need to cue breathing there. The idea with the breathing, if we do use it, is to basically like give people an off switch, or have people, relax when it's appropriate to relax. So like if I have some, and when you're performing or maxing out in a squat, that's actually not the time to relax. But we don't want people like maxing out, so to speak, when they're like doing a plank, or even when they're just sitting down and talking. I mean, I work with some people like who have anxiety and like neck pain and back pain. And when they're talking to you, when you're asking them about their neck, they're like, you could see their, SCMs popping out. And it's like, all right, we're just literally going to get into like, a rock back or a child's pose position. And I want you to breathe without tensing your neck. And just by doing that, they get a lot of their neck range of motion back because they learn that like, I don't need to maximally contract my neck to do the most benign tasks. So it's more about like, if people can do these benign things without having to like tense every muscle in their body and hold their breath, that's kind of all we're looking for. But we're not trying to make breathing this super cognitive thing where like every time people are doing something, they're thinking about it. Because if you're thinking about breathing when you're, on a basketball court, like you're going to get dusted. So I just want to be clear about that.
Yeah, no, that's so well said from all of you. And I can't emphasize enough to the listeners the impactful nature of the way you created this this educational course, going through the various systems and execution points and cueing points, which we really didn't even get into, which was really, really well done. And the feedback, how you guys use, and just understanding. And what I like about you, your program, is that you have bandwidth, as you allow people to understand that this is a foundation, this is our model, but we also understand that there will be some variation in there. And I think that was so wonderfully done. So thank you for putting the course together for people like me who don't have any friends, and all I do is I look at courses and YouTube. So this was great for me. But hey, would you guys share like, what's going on with Resilient, like in the future? Where can they get this course? Are you guys putting like a live course on and stuff where they can come see you? I know right now is a little bit of a tough time, but hopefully soon. So whoever wants to jump in there, go ahead and share where we can learn more about this.
Yeah, so we started doing this course years ago because a local gym had asked us to do it, and they wanted to kind of learn more about what we were doing. And it just was like, all right, if you guys are interested in what we're doing, for sure, like they're friends of us, let's get a group of people together and we'll do it. And then after that, we sort of had some more people start to ask us to do it. So we realized like we should probably make this more accessible for people, take, a lot easier for people to access it if they don't have to spend a weekend and fly across the country to get to a live course. So at this point, we don't have any live courses scheduled. We sort of focused and put all of our eggs into this online platform. I think it's a lot of education is kind of moving that direction anyway. And then obviously with the whole pandemic and everything, it makes it a little bit easier for people to continue to learn. So yeah, if you're interested in the course, it's at our website's resilientperformance.com. It's the website mostly catered towards patients or parents of patients to find out how to work with us in person. But if you go down and you click on education, it'll bring you right to the page, and you can kind of look through it and learn about it and go from there.
Great.
Yeah, and just to add to that, I mean, like we're not opposed to doing in-person courses. We do it like on a demand basis, but it's just not like something that we promote. Like Greg said, we got into it because people asked us to. And really the goal of a lot of these like products that we're going to be releasing is really to kind of like raise the floor more than the ceiling. I mean, I think that what we're doing is really basic, not to say that like an advanced coach can't get something out of it, because everything is a derivation of the basics. But, we like to have these discussions online where it's like, should I use, like the Exos change of direction system or the Lee Taft? Like in real life, I wish that all physical therapists were like, that's the level they were at. With us, it's like, all right, if it's physical therapists, we just want people to do some change of direction work. It doesn't need to be like the best thing in the world. And even like with like lifting and the strength and conditioning community, like we just want people to pay some attention to like, hey, it's not just about how much you squat, it's like how you do it and how you run. So I think from like, if you really want to make an impact, it's more about like, how, not these like 1% discussions, but like, how do we get everybody up to a level where like they can really make an impact on people? And that's kind of our focus right now. Cause like, I don't think we really know what the 1% is, but we do know what like the 80% is. But like, if we're being honest, like a lot of people are even ignoring the 80%. And that's kind of the goal of what we're trying to achieve.
Yeah, that's great. That's awesome. Well, guys, I'll tell you what, I can't thank you enough for doing the course, for taking the time to be on the show and sharing this with the population. And hopefully this, this is something that people take the time to get involved with and learn more, because like you said, you can never be foundational enough.
Yeah.
If you're great at your foundational stuff and then understand where the sequences go from there, you've always got a shot in this profession, or as an athlete, or as a coach, or whatever. So I thank you guys for doing this, and thanks for being on the show.
Thank you.
Thank you, Lee.
Thanks for having us, Lee. Appreciate it.
Awesome. All right.